Okay, what we thought we'd start off with today was a session where we talk about three things, and it may be that we don't get done with talking about all of them this morning and that they bleed a little bit into later in the day. The first of these is about where we've come in terms of what this means for the humanities. You know, I made one of my pitiful jokes that I laugh at a lot last night about David being director of the University of California Creative Industries Research Institute. I'm not suggesting, obviously, that that moniker displays the humanities, but part of me was thinking as we were staggering across to the party last night after our last session, what would it mean if we said, if the humanities are always in crisis, why have them at all? If there's something wrong with them all the time, why not make them something else? What would that do? What would it mean? What will be the cost? What will be the benefits? What will be the difference between that being the case if you're in a Research One university with a major investment, say, in medieval manuscripts that have been collected from Eastern and Western Europe? That's one of the ways in which people come to see you. What would it mean if you have Ian Fleming's notebooks and all his writings? Both those are real-world Midwest university cases. What would it mean if you worked at a non-Research One institution, one where you don't have PhD students, maybe you don't have master's students, or say you're in a community college in the California context where there's massive teaching and the humanities is one foothold where some work can be done that's meant to, in a sense, provide liberal arts componentry to all sorts of things, anything from engineering through to sociology. Would there be a difference between the experiences of getting rid of the humanities in those two domains? What would it mean for critical work, given that the humanities has been very important for queer theory, for post-colonial theory, and so on, as emergent domains, important for Chicano-Chicana studies, for instance, here in California in particular. So those are some questions that I had in my mind, I guess. So that was the first thing that I thought we might get at, because it is one of the underlying themes of the seminar that we've hovered around, I think, rather than quite descending onto. The second one, and this is very much coming out of conversations with Kate and Zhao, by the way, the second theme is this question of the relationship between policy making and intellectual life. What should be the stance of the person who identifies broadly as being an oppositional, critical, leftist intellectual, who is concerned about cultural justice, inequality, and all those forms of subjectification that we've talked about that are so crucial to everyday life? Questions of the definition of the self and the disciplining of the self through sexuality, through race, through gender, through class, through religion, through age, all those, and region, all those sorts of cross-hatching axes of subjectification, be they oppressive and or constructive for those so subjectified. Sorry, it's the Friday morning Foucauldian, but everything is a battle, right? There's the inner truck driver, the inner Wittgenstein, and the inner Foucault. And there's this, sometimes it's a cosmic battle, and Friday morning Michelle's normally on top. So anyway, that policy-making question, right? Because there have been some interesting tensions that I've been hearing about in some of the groups, I mean, productive tensions, I think, about wanting to have a really major critical distance from the organs of power in terms of government, be that government in the private sector or the public sector, versus the desire to be intimately involved in order to make a difference. People who have administrative managerial experience, people who have community activism experience, people who are very cynical, skeptical, let's say at least, about the third sector, the community sector, and so on in all its claims, and people who are almost reflexively anti-statist. How does one bring all those things together, and should those tensions be elided, or should they go away? I happen to think not. I think they're productive and interesting, but how should one talk about them? And thirdly, what could interestingly be the relationship between textual analysis and what some people call institutional analysis or political economy? And of course, ethnography, participant observation becomes part of that too. If you think of some kind of triad that says the texts that are in front of us, however we define them, are enormously important. They inscribe so many positions and potentialities and struggles within them. The ways in which we grasp those texts and how we intersect with one another are tremendously important. And so are the sponsoring, negating, constructing institutions that house those texts and house us. So how do you make all those three interplay? How do you make the law of copyright and the text that you read and the experience of reading intersect interestingly in an analytic way with potential political consequences? Should one, if one is a complete PhD, pay attention to the fact that all Latin American printing publishers that are of significance of books and so on are owned in Spain? Does that matter? Is it important when you read Latin American literature to think about that? Or does it not matter? Is it irrelevant? Does it not shape what's happening? Does it not shape where the money goes? Does it not shape the themes? Does it not shape the power of publishing? For that matter, does it matter that Spain owns lots of the water in Latin America in terms of water companies? Is this a thing to think about? When we're studying California from a humanities perspective, do we need to think about water in relationship to Colorado and Mexico, amongst others? You know, because so much of what makes California what it is a struggle for water, and so much of its textualization is over issues to do with water and is enabled by water. When we study comparative literature or English, should we think about the fact that vast amounts of water are required to make texts, to make magazines, to make books, to make the things that we study? Is that part of what we should be doing, and how might we do it? So those were the three things that we thought would be interesting to ponder, and I think they could take quite a bit of the day, but we'll see how it pans out. How does that seem to all of you? Does that seem interesting? And needless to say, I have a lugubrious, massive amount of material prepared to thrust into my head and then somehow out somewhere. But fortunately, we're going to avoid a bit of that because others of you will speak too. So David, I wondered if you might take the mic for a bit and and chat to us a wee bit about this issue of where you see the humanities today, and what would it mean if we did just say, all right, it's in crisis, let's not have it.
Okay. Let me just begin by taking us back to a slightly earlier moment, although it's one that lingers with us. Fairly late in his career, Derrida wrote a rather interesting piece on two pieces actually, one on the university yet to come and one on the humanities yet to come, right? I mean, that language, that actually John Hartley had in the subtitle of his talk yesterday, and the humanities yet to come, and yet he didn't talk about it at all, although it was kind of implied in what he had to say. Derrida's argument about the humanities yet to come, so within a university yet to come, was a commitment to the responsibility to maintain and sustain free thinking. Thinking without, in a way without restricting oneself by thinking about the consequences to oneself in that set of commitments, right? Of probing the limits and the depths of thinking in relation to what it means to be human, what political commitments there are, how one relates to those commitments in being able to speak in that cliched way now, truth to power, or better yet, truth in the face of power, right? Without troubling oneself, even as one troubles oneself, without giving in to that moment when one troubles oneself about what the consequences will be. And the consequences can be very real. Norman Finkelstein, among others, right, sort of posing the question of Palestine, as some of us do, or posing the question of rights, as some of us do, in the face of closing down the possibility of that set of conversations or discussions.
Can I interrupt there?
Yeah.
Does everybody know who Norman Finkelstein is and what happened to him? you want to just explain that?
Yeah, Norman Finkelstein was at Chicago at DePaul University, and he himself is Israeli, or Israeli by background at least, and was teaching, I believe, in the political science department, and is a has been for a long time a very vocal, if sometimes flat-footed critic of Israeli state policies in relation to Palestine in very blunt spoken terms, and not very nuanced or subtle terms either, but be that as it may, I mean, in some ways courageous, maybe in many ways courageous, and he came up for tenure, and our man Dershowitz weighed in, even though Dershowitz had nothing to do with DePaul University. He's a law professor at Harvard Law School, and a police person of any pronouncement or analytic claims or critical claims regarding the state of Israel, among other things, right? So the same Dershowitz who thinks that it's okay to torture somebody, right, if it's going to save American lives.
His argument about torture derives from his argument about rape, which is that there are degrees of torture and degrees of rape.
Right.
Which was his defense of Mike Tyson.
Yeah. So, I mean, Dershowitz himself a controversial figure, and indeed there'd been an earlier, Finkelstein had published a book with the University of California Press, was about to publish a book with the University of California Press, as it turned out. And Dershowitz wrote a letter both to Linworthy, the director of UC Press, and indeed then to the, when he didn't get what he wanted, which was a dumping of the book before it got published, talk about censorship and the lack of academic freedom. Again, somebody from another university intervening with respect to trying to restrict expression. So Dershowitz had a kind of vendetta against Finkelstein, not least having to do with Finkelstein. The book that UC Press was publishing was a critique by Finkelstein of Dershowitz's positions in relation to Israel. And indeed, in that book, he points out that Dershowitz's own writing on Israel was in good part plagiarized from an earlier work by somebody that he demonstrated quite, that Harvard then examined and claimed was an oversight on Dershowitz's part, that he hadn't that he hadn't looked closely enough at the work of his research assistant, right?
And Dershowitz also, for 1 second, he also wrote to the governor of California.
Yeah,
and he wrote to every member of the board of the University of California Press, threatening to sue them individually if the book came out.
So happily, both Linworthy and the administration of the university took the position of academic freedom and the right to publish this book, and the book indeed was published. So the next thing Dershowitz did was to go after DePaul and to get donors to DePaul to threaten withdrawal of funding. And to cut a long story short, Finkelstein did not get tenure, even though he was better published than many people at the university who had gotten tenure. And indeed, he was, his teaching assessments were quite stellar. He was regarded as a terrific teacher and so on. So they cut a deal with him in the end that paid him a bunch of money in order to go away.
He was voted unanimously by his department.
Yeah, right.
Recommended by the dean every level.
And the president turned him down, right? So, I mean, not to make you feel uncomfortable about your prospects in the academy, but what Derrida is getting at is, of course, despite those possibilities, still having the responsibility, as in responding to sets of circumstances that are so compelling that one feels the need and indeed the urge to speak. Okay, so just now to go back to Derrida, I'm sorry we got sidetracked in this way. To go back to Derrida, this notion of responsibility presupposes two things, and two related things. The first is an intense emphasis on the individual the grounds of responsibility, right? The voice of critical reason is the voice of the individual in conversation with others, but nevertheless still the voice of the individual having to take responsibility in responding to a kind of that Latin respondere, right? The responding to the positions and claims and assessments of others. So that's the first thing. The second is as I say, relatedly, the sense that humanistic work is predicated on this hermetic, somewhere we were talking about earlier on, a kind of cloistered conception of what it means to think, whether critically or not, to think on one's own, even as one's responding to others as they're thinking, whether interpersonally, but certainly in writing, textually. And it represents, now a very long tradition of largely non-collaborative engagement that seems to have been the kind of raison d'etre of work in the humanities. If one thinks of what has happened in the humanities, I mean, we began the seminar 2 weeks ago with my sort of pointing out that what has happened in the humanities in the last 20 or 30 years is an intense period of critical work, where the critical work really did dominate, much to the chagrin of maybe the status quo hitherto and maybe emerging since. An engagement across a series of questions, critically driven, having to do with thinking about the nature of the human, the relation of the human to the animal, the political conditions of what it takes to engage with each other, as one pointed out in response to my earlier remarks. Obviously in relation to a transforming world, a transforming academy. Toby edited a book on cultural studies with a wonderful article by McCool and what was Gibson and McCool on interdisciplinarity, pointing out that that cultural studies emerges in response to the kind of the post-war heterogenizing, diversification of the class diversification they had in mind, but increasingly one can also say ethno-racial diversification of the student bodies, and by extension, but much more slowly, the faculty bodies, certainly within the humanities and much less so in other parts of the academy. And that sense of demographic transformation also in a kind of interactive way alongside with and prompting and promoting and being prompted and promoted by transforming intellectual interests began to transform the academy through the 60s, the post-colonial moment, the civil rights moment in this country, interactive with each other, began to transform the kinds of interests, the kinds of disciplinary and transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary formations that one got, and fueled a series of critical engagements, often under duress, right? Maybe the expressive high point of which, in intellectual terms, perhaps came in some of the most repressive moments in this country in the 1980s and 1990s. Right, so there's a kind of interesting around questions of the culture wars, a response to those things, around questions of diversity, affirmative action, and the restrictive responses or critiques of them, around issues of the post-colonial and the transformation both of our world and of the academy in the world, and the play of post-structuralism critically in this set of debates. But what is curious is that as these debates unfolded, what one found was also an increasing abstraction and abstruseness to the language of the debates themselves. So increasingly, as these issues became more and more important, they very largely became less and less available in a broader public sphere, right? I mean, there was this kind of double-edged consideration around what it means to be a public intellectual, and the public intellectual became more and more constrained, I think, right, within the scope of things. And I've had, I don't know how many senior administrators at the University of California and elsewhere bemoan the, an easy bemoaning because, the humanities, they just talk to themselves, we don't understand what they do, we don't understand the language they employ, or do you understand physics if you're not a physicist? I mean, there's similar kind of response, right? But the part of the responsibility was our own, right, in finding ourselves shrinking in certain sorts of ways. And many of us have struggled over, whether it's about enrollments or whether it's shrinking enrollments or whether it's about a repositing of the humanities in order to be more available, even as it doesn't give us its set of critical commitments. How do you think the humanities are new? Now, I don't want to say that the humanities are in crisis, because we constantly are thinking that the humanities are in crisis, and maybe that is just its fuel, right? That from one generation to the next, it fuels itself as it expresses the critical limits of thinking from whether from Hume onwards. I mean, Hume himself, in his philosophical mode, plumbed the depths of the limits of thinking at the end of the in the late 18th century, and was ridiculed in some ways for it. Not unlike the ridicule of some members of the some notable members of the humanities today. So you think, along the same lines, that Derrida, for all his importance, got a scathing obituary in the New York Times, in the moment of his death, right? You ask yourself what that was about, right? Why would, the newspaper of note in a country like this come out at the time, and I say this because he was a colleague, to some degree a friend, somebody who was on this campus for 20 years, who had a very, very visible effect on engagements on this campus, and so on in various sorts of ways. And yet he was he was really taken to task for the effect he'd had on the academy in general and on the humanities in particular. At the moment, he could no longer answer for it. That's you ask sort of what's going on in that moment, and I think it's not unconnected to the way in which the humanities was being seen to be positioned in the public sphere, and the fight over what the humanities are and what they can do for us. So let me return, sort of in these rather scattered remarks, to thinking about the kinds of issues I think the humanities represents today. The first and foremost is this broad question of what it means to be human in our time, which is not to say it's only about our time, right? It's not only a presentist project, because to think what it means to be human in our time means to think what it has meant to be human at any time, which is not to say it's the same thing necessarily, right? But one has to pose the question of what it is to be human in our time by thinking it in terms of and in relation to and indeed against what it has meant to be human before. And in our time, it also means to think that question, as Derrida urged or urges us to think it without a limit. right? To think it without constraint of the Dershowitzes of the world or of, you know, the religious traditionalists of our time and so on and so forth, right? What is the relation of the human to the animal? To, as Derrida puts it, the beastly. Indeed, the beastly in us, right? So that, I think, for the humanities has always been the key question, even as the response to it has changed over time. So first point. The second is the question of, as I put it, translation at the beginning of the seminar, and that notion of translating ourselves to ourselves in our time, and when I say ourselves, I mean ourselves in an expansive sense, not just ourselves narrowly, either within the humanities or myself in the quietness of my study, or and so on. And in saying a translation of ourselves to ourselves, it means translating others to ourselves and ourselves to others, which of course raises a question of otherness in all its complexity, right? In all its dimensionality, in all its cultural similarity and difference, right? And so culture becomes a key component of this set of considerations. A third implication of this, or point I guess I want to make, is one that has been central to the way in which humanities has been taught across the University of California for the past decade. And I say this in official terms because it's part of official documents, is to think of the humanities as, in its instrumental terms, so in its teaching terms, how it engages students and so on, in what is, you know, among the most diverse student body in the country, if not the world, 60 to 65, diverse and not diverse. I mean, it's troubled, right? So 60 to 65% of undergraduate student bodies at UCLA, Berkeley, Irvine, and San Diego are American Asian, probably the most significant percentage of any campus or set of campuses in America. You know, while at most of those campuses, the African American population in a state in which the population is 7%, African American is only 2%, right? And Latino is not much more, 3 or 4 or 5%, I think, depending on the campus. So you can see, you know, in a state in which the overall population is 25%, the population, the Latino population of LA is roughly 50%, and so on. So you can see the kind of skewedness of those numbers in dramatic terms in a state that ended affirmative action and wants to end all, you know, I mean, there's been a promotion of ending all reference to race in public official sort of sets of considerations. So in all of that, the commitment has been to the humanities as forms of cultural literacy, right, in all their complexities. Linguistic literacy, literacy in the visual arts, literacy in technology, both in the narrow and broader sense of the term literacy. Literacy in the sense of understanding the meanings, the values, the significance, right, that those considerations pose. And so I think that what one is seeing in the humanities today is a bifurcation, really a struggle between two visions of what the humanities are. On the one hand, I think you're beginning to see, and you know, this is speculative, and I doubt anybody in this room would be interested in practicing this form of the humanities, but I think you're seeing it emerging out of the likes of English departments and maybe some other literature departments, is the emergence of a new formalism, right? That is starting to take place, that I think will grow, and a new formalism, of course, linked to older formalisms in the 1950s and maybe into the 1960s when it began to be eroded. but a formalism that is concerned with form, with genre, with in the sense that that's all there is to the humanities, right? Or should be to the humanities. That we should be there's a concern with literary Darwinism, for example, a new movement taking place in programs like George Mason and so forth.
Could you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah.
Can you just give some examples?
Yeah, well, there's a concern with going back to texts and looking at the formal apparatus of texts,
Right.
without attending to the social and political sets of considerations underpinning them on the one hand,
Right.
or to the modes of meaning making and significance that emerge out of those sets of social, political, and cultural conditions.
And this is presented as a kind of backlash to the over.
It's not presented, but I think it is. It doesn't see itself as that, but absolutely.
Those other kinds of ways.
Absolutely, there's no question in my
So
mind.
it's not just another.
Right, and it's it's not necessarily you might not just tie it to a kind of knee-jerk response. Oh, those are conservative people, right? It comes out of folks who had in previous moments a commitment to Marxist or neo-Marxist sets of positions. So you're seeing interesting sets of repositionings of people who have been dismissive of claims about the kinds of diversities that we've seen in practice, as much as in demographic sets of considerations, as a way of retaining a kind of institutional power, right? Within.
Driven by. It's about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question.
It's not ideological in the broader sense.
I think it's both.
Right.
I mean, I don't think you get the one without the other, right? But a reconfiguration of the ideological, right? I mean, it's not. It's not.
It doesn't, as you say, come straightforwardly from a conservative.
Yeah. Although it is very conservative in its implications.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I was talking. I remember trying to talk to someone about this a little bit, maybe about a couple of months ago, and the phrase he used was "return to the fundamentalism of the discipline."
Yeah.
I mean, and because I feel like I've noticed what you've described, and I wonder if there's also a sense that I wonder if there's a fear that if that the disciplines will kind of disappear, and the institutional power of certain academic disciplines will disappear. But I'm also connecting with that Boris Johnson speech, and so I'm because of that, I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about these this kind of struggle for institutional power, the relationship between that and the kind of wider ideological conditions that you think are producing this.
Well, more narrowly within the institution, with changing demographics, with changing research formations, right, and disciplinary and departmental formations. I mean, what you've had on different, English within the humanities, English in particular, has retained an enormous institutional power just in terms of numbers at a time when student numbers, because of the kind of the economic rationalization of the institutions, the kind of bean counting has largely produced the capacity to maintain a kind of economic power within so getting more resources, having more resources available is a function of how many students you have, particularly at the undergraduate level, though not only, right? And those sorts of measures, because in Britain it's different. I mean, it's you have the assessments every 5 years and so on. Australia similarly. But here it's sort of, you don't have those 5-year assessments, nationally. You have intra-institutional assessments, and they're largely driven around FTE sets of consideration. how many lines you're getting, what kind of research support you have, what kind of graduate student support you have, and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of narrow or narrower set of considerations going on. Right? On the other hand, the discomfort with certain kinds of undertaking within the academy, particularly in the humanities, right, of cultural, political, social critique, a discomfort that that the kind that work is promoted by and promotes interdisciplinarity and that is undermining of disciplinary commitments, right? I think has been an important set of conditions in producing this response. So, on one hand, you could say, I mean, try to be a little clearer. Sorry, I'm still fuzzy-headed. To be a little clearer about it, I mean, what I would say is that the concern about the erosion of disciplines is as deeply at the grounds of this now counter-emergence as possibly anything, as possibly any wider set of considerations. So the sense that what it means to be disciplined, right, in every sense of the term, what kinds of methodological commitments that entails, how one measures, assesses, right, the capacity of students, undergraduate and graduate, right, is by being trained in the set of disciplinary commitments that are now produced. And formalism seems now to be a kind of knee-jerk response or reaction to being able to recuperate that set of disciplinary commitment. And I think the two go hand in hand. I mean, there have been debates on this campus, and these get produced at moments of intense budgetary constraint, right, under which now the University of California operates, because there's no budget at the moment. I mean, what is paying for this is last year's money, basically, right, because we don't have this year's money, even though we're now almost 3 months into the new fiscal year, right? So, because there's no budget yet, and it doesn't look like there might be one for another 3 months, for all we know. Right? So, there have been intense debates on this campus about cutting, I mean, from history, the two largest programs in the humanities, which are traditionally, not just here, but elsewhere, English, 600 majors, you add another 300 majors for a journalism sort of program that they have on top of it. So it's 900 majors, in a humanities program that maybe has 2,000 majors in total, right? So the 900 are English, and it's satellites, and another 350 are history. So what's that? 60% are two large departments, right? And those two are going after anything that's interdisciplinary to say, cut them all, right? Whether they research institutes, I mean, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's International Center for Writing and Translation, really important. Cut its money. We want its money. Cut UCHRI. Cut the critical theory emphasis. Cut the critical theory institute. I mean, the things that made the humanities on the Irvine campus for the last 25 years, on which the humanities were built, right, are being attacked right under these kinds of, and I don't think it's unique to this campus by any long stretch of the imagination. So on the one side, you've got that sort of formations tied to what I'm seeing as a newly emergent formalism, and on the other, you've got the extension of the last 20 or 25 years of critical theory, of post-colonial studies, of the interdisciplinarity programs, women's studies, the so-called ethnic studies programs, and so on and so forth, sort of in tension with each other. And the tension is now a kind of, you might call it an insurgent, what I mark as formalism, just for want of a better term, related to these sets of deeper structural concerns that I'm talking about. right? On the one hand, then also tied to in tension with a now defensive, if not defendant, defensive formation of the last 25 years related to this other set of concerns. And I think that's going to get more robust, not least if we see a certain outcome in this election, right? In this country, at least. I mean, that kind of conservative extension, it's no longer a swing, but a kind of an older conservationist kind of retention, right? And then the question is how one responds in relation to that. And what is interesting is about the last 2 weeks is creative societies, cultural studies, cultural industries, creative societies, produces, I mean, if it really is a newly emergent institutional formation, produces a way of robustly extending the second of the formations in the tension by drawing on the critical work of the last 25 years, right? So that was all made up as I got up.